Welcome to Touching Life Deeply channel. This research series is published on the channel at 8 SEO p.m.
And hello, everyone. A warm welcome from me, too. Great to have you with us for another deep dive.
Absolutely. So today we're really getting into something fascinating. It's that deep connection, sometimes really surprising, between our hormones and, well, our emotional lives. We've gathered insights from quite a bit of research, various sources actually, shared by a listener who is really digging into this exact link.
Yeah, that's a popular topic.
It is. So think of this as, your guide to understanding how these powerful chemical messengers inside you, they're not just running the physical show, they're constantly communicating with your brain, shaping your mood, how you react to stress, even how you connect with people.
That's the core of it.
Our mission here is really to unpack what the latest science is telling us about this interplay and what it actually means for you.
And it's a vital mission, I think, because this connection, well, it's anything but straightforward. Looking at the materials, we'll be exploring some key hormonal players. We're talking about thyroid hormones, their foundational impact.
Right.
Then there's the well-known stress hormone, cortisol.
Right.
The wide-ranging influence of sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone. Oxytocin, too, the one often linked with social bonding.
I love a hormone.
That's the one. And we'll even touch on a few others, ones usually known for metabolism. But guess what? They also seem to have a say in your emotional state.
It really sounds complex.
It is. It's less like separate musicians playing solos.
Yeah.
And much more like a whole orchestra,
Yeah.
Hormones and emotions constantly influencing each other back and forth.
Okay, so let's start with that foundational idea, hormones. We usually think physical stuff, right? Growth, hunger, reproduction cycle.
The usual suspects.
Exactly. They are biochemical messengers sending signals through your blood to pretty much every cell. But what the research keeps showing again and again is their huge impact on the brain.
Profound, really.
Yeah, and by extension, our psychological states, our emotions, it's a much more integrated system than maybe we used to think.
Precisely. And what's so interesting, like you said, and the sources really hammer this home, is that it's a two-way street. Definitely.
Bidirectional.
Yes. It's not just hormones calling the shots on your feelings. Your emotional state, your experiences, they can directly trigger changes in your hormone levels.
Give us an example.
Well, think about feeling stressed out. Right? That feeling, that mental state, it immediately kicks off a hormonal cascade, releasing cortisol, getting your body ready.
Fight or flight.
Exactly. Or, consider the monthly cycle many people experience, those predictable hormonal shifts.
Yeah.
They're clearly tied to noticeable mood changes for a lot of individuals. So it's this constant feedback loop, this ongoing conversation inside us. It's fundamental.
Okay, that makes sense. A two-way street. So with that foundation, let's dive in some specific connections from the research. Let's start with one that seems like a real powerhouse, regulating so much, including our emotional climate, the thyroid.
Ah, yes, the thyroid. That little gland at the base of your neck. Its hormones, T3 and T4 primarily, they're absolutely essential. Metabolism, energy production.
Right.
But critically for us today, they significantly impact brain function.
How so?
Well, they influence things like how well your neurons talk to each other, the activity of key neurotransmitters. Because its reach is so wide, when the thyroid's function is off, even a little bit, if there's an imbalance, it can seriously disrupt mental health. Profoundly, sometimes.
So how does that actually look? Does it depend on whether it's like underactive or overactive?
Yes, the sources are very clear about distinct patterns.
Yeah.
If you have hypothyroidism, that's when your thyroid isn't making enough hormones. It's strongly, consistently linked with depression.
Depression, okay.
Yeah. We're talking symptoms like just feeling wiped out all the time, that mental fog, sluggishness, losing interest or pleasure in things, anhedonia, sometimes weight gain too.
That sounds rough.
It is. And the research, well, it points to some pretty striking numbers. We're talking maybe 20, even 30% of people diagnosed with hypothyroidism. They also have significant depressive symptoms.
Wow. 20 to 30%. How does that compare normally?
Well, think about it this way. That's roughly 5 times higher than the rate of depression in the general population.
5 times. Goodness. That really shows how a physical issue can look exactly like what we call a mental health problem.
Absolutely. The proposed link often involves reduced activity of neurotransmitters, like serotonin and dopamine.
Okay, so low thyroid, higher risk of depression. What about the flip side? Too much thyroid hormone.
That's hyperthyroidism. Your thyroid's basically in overdrive, pumping out too much hormone.
Yeah.
And this state, strongly linked to anxiety.
Anxiety, okay.
Symptoms look quite different. Nervousness, restlessness, irritability, maybe trouble sleeping, heart pounding or racing, even physical tremors.
So kind of agitated.
Very much so.
Eh,
And for people with hyperthyroidism, the rate of anxiety can be really high, sometimes up to 50%, the sources suggest.
half of them. Wow.
Yeah. The thinking is that the excess hormones accelerate brain activity. They really impact those neurotransmitter systems, serotonin, dopamine, noradrenaline, creating this sort of heightened arousal state in the nervous system.
Makes sense.
And here's something quite remarkable. In people who are already predisposed to bipolar disorder, an overactive thyroid might even trigger manic episodes.
Really? So it sounds like checking thyroid function ought to be standard practice in mental health checks.
It really should be considered given how much these symptoms can overlap or even be driven by the thyroid. And the sources also mention autoimmune thyroid conditions like Hashimoto's.
Where the body attacks the thyroid.
Exactly. That's not just damaging the gland, it's also linked to a higher risk of mood disorders. It suggests maybe inflammation, which is common in autoimmune issues, could be another piece of the puzzle here.
It's interesting.
And remember that two-way street. Chronic stress, especially emotional stress over time, can negatively affect the whole system regulating your thyroid, the HHT axis.
Hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis.
Yeah. High levels of cortisol, that stress hormone, might actually suppress thyroid hormone production. So stress could potentially contribute to developing hypothyroidism.
So it all connects back. The thyroid is clearly huge. What about that hormone we always hear about when we talk stress? Cortisol.
Right, cortisol. A major player in the HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. That's your body's main stress response control center.
Okay.
Cortisol's job, essentially, is to mobilize resources when you perceive a threat. Physical danger, maybe just a tight deadline.
Everyday life? Sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah. It increases blood sugar for energy, sharpens your senses a bit,
Yeah.
and kind of puts the brakes on functions that aren't essential for immediate survival.
Makes sense for a quick burst of stress, but like you said, modern life, stress is often chronic, just goes on and on. What happens then with cortisol always high? How does that affect emotions?
That's exactly where the issues start. The research consistently links chronically high cortisol levels to a greater risk for anxiety, depression, even conditions like PTSD. And here's where it gets really compelling, I think. Prolonged exposure to high cortisol can actually harm a key part of your brain, the hippocampus.
The hippocampus. Wait, isn't that crucial for memory? And emotion, too?
You got it. Vital for forming new memories, yes, but also plays a big role in regulating your emotional responses. The sources highlight that sustained high cortisol can impair its function. And in some cases, there's even evidence it might lead to structural changes, like atrophy.
Atrophy, meaning it can actually shrink.
Essentially, yes, lose volume over time. This damage makes it harder for you to manage your emotions effectively, and it increases vulnerability to mood disorders. Plus, even just messing up the normal daily rhythm of cortisol, it should generally be higher in the morning, lower at night. That disruption alone can negatively impact emotional well-being.
So stress isn't just a feeling. It has these concrete, potentially damaging effects on brain areas tied to emotion and memory. And hormones like cortisol are the messengers doing it.
Right.
Powerful stuff.
It really is.
Okay, moving beyond stress.
Right.
What about those big hormone groups tied to, development, reproduction, sex hormones? Do they play a role in mood?
Oh, absolutely. The gonadal hormones, mainly estrogen and testosterone. We know their reproductive roles, of course.
Yeah.
But the research increasingly shows their broad influence throughout the body and brain. They significantly affect mood, energy, even things like aggression or motivation.
Estrogen often comes up with women's mood, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Estrogen specifically is often described in the research as having sort of mood-enhancing properties. It seems to interact well with neurotransmitters like serotonin.
Okay.
But crucially, it's often the fluctuations in estrogen levels that are strongly linked to mood difficulties for many women. Think about the big shifts during the menstrual cycle, pregnancy, the postpartum period, and especially around menopause.
Right.
These times of rapid or significant hormonal change, they're frequently associated with things like mood swings, increased irritability, a higher vulnerability to depression and anxiety.
And what about testosterone? We usually hear aggression, but the sources said mood, too.
Yes, definitely mood. And it's important for mood regulation in both men and women, just at different baseline levels. While very high levels might link to aggression, low levels of testosterone are clearly associated with negative mood states. Things like depression and fatigue, particularly noted in men.
Interesting.
And the research also points out that age-related declines, sometimes called andropause in men, can contribute to shifts in emotional stability and mood as men get older.
Ah.
So yeah, these hormones are active across our whole lifespan, and their ups and downs often mirror key emotional transitions.
It's really amazing how these major life stages and hormonal shifts line up and affect how we feel. Okay, switching gears a bit, what about hormones linked more to social stuff? Connection.
That would lead us to oxytocin, often called the love hormone or the bonding hormone.
Right.
It's absolutely crucial for forming social connections, that incredibly powerful bond between a mother and baby, romantic attachments, even just fostering trust and cooperation in groups.
So it helps us connect. But how does it help regulate emotions in those social situations?
Well, it seems to work in a few important ways. One, oxytocin can act as a buffer against stress. It can actually dampen the activity of that HPA axis we talked about.
The stress system.
Exactly. Potentially lowering cortisol release, calming that fight or flight feeling, especially when you're around other people. So it promotes calmness, reduces anxiety in social contexts.
That makes sense.
It also appears to enhance empathy, our ability to understand and share the feelings of others, and helps us read emotional cues better. Both are pretty fundamental for smooth relationships and staying emotionally balanced when interacting.
Definitely.
And here's something really fascinating from the sources. Variations in our genes, specifically the gene for the oxytocin receptor, the OXTR gene, might actually influence how sensitive each of us is to oxytocin.
So our genetics play a role.
It seems so. These genetic differences could affect our social behavior, how well we regulate emotions, and maybe even our susceptibility to certain mood disorders.
Wow. So even our genes influence how much the love hormone affects us. Another layer. Now, the sources also briefly mention some other hormones, ones we usually link to metabolism, but they have emotional ties too.
Yes, and this just really drives home how interconnected everything is, doesn't it? Body and mind. They touched on insulin, that key hormone for blood sugar regulation. Issues like insulin resistance, common in prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, have been linked in studies to higher rates of depression.
Interesting.
Then there's leptin. That's the hormone that tells your brain you're full. It interacts with brain pathways involved in emotion and reward processing. Research suggests leptin resistance might connect to depressive-like behaviors,
Okay.
and even ghrelin, the hunger hormone that stimulates appetite.
Hmm.
Some experimental models suggest it might actually have anti-anxiety or antidepressant effects, possibly by boosting stress resilience.
So even hunger signals are tied into our emotional state.
It seems that way. It really shows how our physical state, down to how we handle sugar or feel hunger, is deeply woven into how we feel emotionally.
Okay, this has been a huge tour. We've hit the thyroid, cortisol, sex hormones, oxytocin, even these metabolic ones, all showing these deep links to our feelings. So let's pull it all together. What does this actually mean for us, for you listening right now? Why should you care about these deep, sometimes hidden hormonal connections?
Well, this knowledge is incredibly important, I think, because it really pushes us towards a more holistic way of looking at mental health. It argues strongly for an integrated approach.
Right.
The sources really emphasize that understanding these hormonal factors is vital for, first, better diagnosis, and second, more effective treatments.
How does it help with diagnosis?
It just highlights how crucial it is for doctors to consider checking hormone function, especially thyroid levels, when someone comes in with symptoms of depression or anxiety.
Makes sense.
And the other way around, too, maybe screening patients with known hormonal conditions for common mood issues. Accurate diagnosis often means looking at the interplay between these systems, not just treating symptoms in a vacuum.
Are there specific signs to look out for?
Yeah, the sources mention things that should perhaps raise a flag. Prompt testing, like persistent fatigue you can't explain, feeling mentally slower, ongoing insomnia, unusual irritability, or significant weight changes that aren't intentional. If those are happening alongside mood problems, exploring the hormonal side seems worthwhile.
Good to know. And how does this knowledge change treatment approaches?
Well, it shows that sometimes fixing the underlying hormone imbalance itself can lead to really significant improvements in mood. The classic example highlighted is adequate hormone replacement for hypothyroidism.
Right, getting those thyroid levels back to normal.
Exactly. By doing that, you can help correct the related neurochemical issues in the brain that were fueling the depression. It can make a huge difference in energy, mental clarity, overall quality of life for those individuals.
So treating the hormone problem is treating the mood problem in those cases.
In many cases, yes.
Yeah.
But, and this is really important, the sources stress this hormone therapy isn't presented as some kind of magic bullet or the only answer for mood issues.
Right, it's not that simple.
No. This research strongly backs a multidisciplinary approach. That means bringing together different strategies, maybe medication if needed, but also proven therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, psychotherapy, learning solid stress management techniques.
As a whole toolkit approach.
Precisely. And we absolutely shouldn't forget the power of lifestyle changes. Things like focusing on a healthy diet, getting regular exercise, making sleep a priority, actively using stress reduction methods. These can have a really significant, indirect, but powerful positive effect on your hormonal balance.
Supporting overall well-being.
Exactly, which in turn supports better emotional regulation.
Mm.
The sources also touch on the added complexity when someone has other conditions, like diabetes or heart disease. That requires really integrated care across different medical fields to manage everything together: hormonal, metabolic, and mental health.
It's a compelling picture of the mind-body connection, truly driven by these hormones. But, as you mentioned, science doesn't have all the answers yet. The sources pointed that out, too. What are some of the next steps? What are researchers trying to figure out now about this hormone-emotion link?
Yeah, that's a great question. Where is this going? There are definitely still big questions being tackled. Researchers are working hard to pinpoint the very specific, like molecular mechanisms. How exactly does this hormone influence that emotional state in the brain? Getting down to those
That's
details.
nitty-gritty.
Exactly. They're also looking closely at the long-term effects of different hormone therapies, not just on the target condition, but on emotional regulation and overall mental health over years, making sure treatments are really optimal for both body and mind.
Makes sense. What other new frontiers are emerging?
Oh, some really fascinating areas, like exploring the complex conversation between our hormone systems and our gut microbiome, all those microbes in our digestive system. That gut-brain hormone axis is a really hot topic.
I've heard about that.
There's also more focus on how environmental factors might play a role. Things like exposure to endocrine-disrupting chemicals found in some plastics or pesticides, or even how disrupted sleep from things like blue light exposure might impact hormones and emotions.
Environmental links.
And critically, studying all of this in diverse groups of people, different ethnicities, ages, genders, socioeconomic backgrounds, because these dynamics might look different depending on context. We need that broader understanding.
Absolutely. And one last area I mentioned.
Looking deeper into our individual genetic and epigenetic makeup, how do our specific genes and the way our environment switches genes on or off over time affect how sensitive we are to hormonal shifts?
Why some people react more strongly than others.
Precisely. Understanding that could lead to much more personalized ways to diagnose and treat these issues down the road, really tailoring things to the individual. Ultimately, this whole complex, evolving picture just serves as such a powerful reminder, doesn't it? How deeply fundamentally intertwined our physical health and our emotional well-being truly are.
And finally, some of the information in this research episode has been compiled from public sources and scientific publications. We are not responsible for any misuse of the content beyond its intended purpose of education and raising awareness. Don't forget to follow Touching Life Deeply so you won't miss our next meaningful insights.